Now this is a werewolf tank. It's put out by Mantic Games as part of their Firefight 2nd Edition tabletop game. Now, if you're thinking, yeah, but I don't care about Mantic Games or werewolf tanks or Firefight 2nd Edition or tabletop gaming at all, it's okay, because the point of this is not to build a tabletop gaming piece. The point of this series of videos that I'm going to be working on, centered around this tank, are going to be demonstrations of techniques. Deep dive, detailed, show all the guts and glory, details of everything from painting to weathering to chipping to rusting to staining to whatever. And this is going to be the canvas. So if you're thinking, nah, that's not my thing, this is just a canvas. I just needed some plastic to put stuff on. And this is a cheap way to do it. And it gives me lots of greeblies to demonstrate stuff on. Now, for years, I've talked about having some kind of model standing by that you can use for testing, for trying things out, for trying new products, for seeing how products interact. I call it a test mule. I don't know why I came up with that name. I don't even know if I came up with that name. I'm so old I don't remember. For years, I've used this little Hobby Boss 172 scale Hellcat. And you can see that I've done all sorts of stuff to it. And I've sanded it down. I've cleaned it off. I've put more stuff on it. I've primed over it. I've put decals on it. All sorts of stuff. So I'm still using this, but I thought this would be a good one to have standing by because of all the little greeblies on it. And you might want to consider having something like this. And it doesn't have to be something as official, I guess you'd say, as an actual model kit. You might go to the dollar store and find a hard plastic toy and just prime it. That becomes your test mule. But having something standing by that you're not worried about, am I going to ruin it? That's one of the biggest keys, I think, to helping people along, is they get worried, am I going to ruin it? Am I going to ruin it? Well, no. Unless you set fire to the thing, you're not going to ruin it. It's just paint and plastic. You can always go back over it. But if you have something that just kind of in your head lets you know, it doesn't matter what I do to this, then when you go to your model that you're actually working on, you feel more freedom because you've tested it here first. So I think it's a great thing to have in general. Now, I assembled this in the standard way. I followed the instructions and left a couple of sub-assemblies. Sub-assemblies are going to help you make sure that you can paint things a little easier. That tends to be the breakdown that I look for. How's it going to make it easier to paint? Some models require more sub-assemblies, some less. Sometimes you might decide to make a sacrifice for ease of painting because of the realities of assembly. For example, on a lot of models, I leave the tracks off and put them on later. But on this one, I just decided to go with it. I'm going to be putting so much mud and other stuff around on the tracks in the lower part of the hull, I figured it won't matter anyway. But that's a part you may leave off till later because you want to paint it separately and really keep it separate. In this case, I kept it simple though. The turret can come off and these fuel tanks on the back can come off. That way I can get to everything, but I don't have a whole lot of parts floating around. I primed everything with Mr. Mahogany rattle can primer. I'm going to be using, for painting, I'm going to be using water-based acrylic paints. So whenever you're using water-based acrylic paints, you want to always prime the model. So I just did it with a rattle can, but you can do it with a rattle can, you can do it with your airbrush, you can even brush paint some primers. The main thing is get a decent coat of primer on there. The color, it doesn't matter. It kind of does, but it doesn't matter. If you just have black primer or gray primer, go with it. Now, I chose this brown primer because I'm going to be painting green over this, and green goes over brown really well, and it keeps the color fairly vibrant. If I would have primed it in black, that would have desaturated the color a little bit, but it would have provided some shadows. If I would have primed it in gray, it would have meant that I had to work a little harder to cover up the gray and make sure there's no little gray streaks showing through and things like that. You decide, but I tend to go with either this brown primer, black primer, or gray primer. I keep it simple, but if you want to speed the process up, you can find a primer that's going to be the same color or close to what you want your base coat to be, and you can knock out both the priming and the base coating in one step. Now, everything I'm going to be doing in this series is going to be brush painting. I am very experienced with airbrushing. I've airbrushed hundreds of models. I have more airbrushes than I know what to do with. But I've really started enjoying brush painting. And so I want to show how to do brush painting, because I think brush painting is something that anybody can get into. There's no need for specialized equipment. Some brushes, some paints, and you get to town. If you're learning how to airbrush, a lot of the techniques that I'm going to show will work with an airbrush with some slight modification. And if I remember, I may mention them along the way. But this is going to be focused on brush painting because, like I said, I find it to be a lot of fun. And if you've watched any of my videos, you know that that's what it comes down to. If you're not having fun, you're doing it wrong. So I really, really urge you to do what I do. Focus on having fun with it, and everything else will flow just fine. Now, when it comes to brush painting, you may be thinking, yeah, but you leave all these brush marks and it just looks kind of streaky. I used to think that. And then as I got into switching from building aircraft, which I airbrushed almost exclusively, to building sci-fi gaming pieces, things like that, and started looking at a wider variety of creators who did brush painting, I started seeing that there's actually ways to paint your model and come out with a fairly smooth finish. Not quite as smooth as an airbrush. Nothing's going to be as smooth as an airbrush, but come out very close to as smooth as an airbrush with anything from fairly patchy, weathered looking coverage all the way up to fully opaque, and use a brush and not leave a bunch of brush strokes. Now, the trick for me, and it's not really a trick, but the solution for me has been to switch to one of these larger dry brush type brushes. Now, this is from Rosemary & Co. I highly recommend them. I like using their brushes. If you're saying, yes, but I use Artis Opus. Well, guess what? Rosemary & Co. makes Artis Opus, so you can get the same brush, less price. Anyway, but you could use a makeup brush. You could use anything that's a large, soft, rounded brush like this. And the reason that this is so effective, I think, for brush painting a good base coat is because instead of painting it on like you normally would with a larger brush, is you thin your paints down and you kind of pounce it like that, and you build it up in multiple coats. Depending on how you thin your paints, it may take 2, 3, 4 coats, but what you end up with is a very smooth finish that doesn't have brush strokes all in it, and it's got very good coverage. Now, the key is you'll have to figure out on your own as you do it how much thinning you want to do with your paints, because you can thin them a lot and it will give you a very, very smooth finish, but you'll have to do a lot more applications. The less you thin it, the fewer applications of paint you'll have to make, but the higher the chance that you're going to add texture from the thicker paint. So there's a point where you kind of find the happy medium, and it can vary between brands of paint and even colors within the same brand. So you may have to experiment. My recommendation is, if you've never done this, to start off with your paints a little more thin than not. And if you see that it's way thinner than you want, then you can add a little bit of paint. And of course, the converse is true, that if you start putting it on and you say, wait, that's a little too thick, just add a little more water. But I think you'll find that it gives you a great way to get very good coverage, and you can even add in more colors as you're going along and get blends and things like that. It's not as precise as using an airbrush, But at the same time, the barrier to entry is very, very low. Even if you don't order something like this to use, if you just go and find a cheap makeup brush from the dollar store, from Walmart or Walgreens, or I think the first time I used one of these, I actually stole it from our bathroom from my wife, and she didn't figure it out for a few days. But it worked. They work really well. So it's something that I recommend you try out, because you can also get some really, really cool effects that you can't get with an airbrush. So there's some pluses and minuses to it. Now my base coat is going to be this Fury Green from Too Thin Coats Paints. Now, am I using this for any special property or anything like that? No, it's just paint I like. If you like Vallejo paint, if you like, Citadel, if you like AK 3rd generation, scale 75, any of the water-based acrylics, and there's loads of them on the market, then use whatever you want. This is just, I picked this for the color. Because if you look here in the background, you'll see I've got scale color 75, I've got Vallejo, I've got shelves of Citadel, I've got all of those things. Now, you see how much I put in my palette. I'm going to put in about an equal amount of water. And I'm not being precise. I'm eyeballing it. That may be a little more water than paint. And I'm just going to grab something and I'm going to stir it up. Give it a good stir. And I'd already shaken the bottle of paint beforehand, so I know it was well mixed. Now, here's a little trick. Make use, if your model has an underside that people aren't going to see, make use of it. This is where you test out thinning ratios. This is where you test out mixing. This is where you test out colors. This is where you put one swatch of color and another swatch next to it. This is a great test area, because at the end, all you've got to do is just take a darker color and paint over it. Now, all I'm going to do is take that thinned paint that I've got. I'm going to put this little piece of paper towel here. And what I'll do is I just touch in just a little, and I dab off a little extra. And then I just start putting it on. And I see if I like how I've thinned it. Now, I want this to be a fairly weathered looking tank. So I want it to be very patchy looking. So one coat of this, you see how that's going on. That's the effect that I want. That's how I want it to look. Now, you may be looking at that and going, whoa, that's way too thin. Maybe. You may decide to add a little more paint into your mix so that you can thicken it up and get a little bit more opacity. But like I said, my goal is to have a very, very patchy and weathered looking tank. So I want that poke through effect happening. And you see that the water, it's pooling, it's doing some what they call tea staining or coffee staining. But because I'm going to be adding multiple coats, I'm not too worried about that. Now you may notice that there's some areas like right here along this side here where it's a little harder to get to. There's a couple of ways to do that. You can push harder. Sometimes you just got to kick the door down. But another thing that I always like to keep handy is a smaller dry brush like that. It makes it easy to get into areas like that. So let me get this bottom covered up. We'll use this as kind of the demonstrator piece. And we'll keep moving on. One thing I forgot to mention, because the paint is very wet, I can keep working it. Look at how I'm able to work that and just kind of spread it out. And it's not drying yet. Now you can take this too far. If it starts drying too much, you'll start tearing the paint. But because it's very wet, and I just keep working it, see, I'm not adding any extra paint. just kind of spreading it around a little more like that. And then what I can do is I can take my handy dandy hair dryer, dry this off a little bit. Now that that's dried off, I can begin applying another layer. I do recommend that you dry it between layers because that way when you put on the next round of paint, this will be dry to the touch and you won't have problems with the first layer getting pulled up when you apply the second layer. Now at this point, you may choose to add a lighter color. You may choose to do some dry brushing. This may be the effect that you want to go for. You know, if you're looking for a weathered start to a tank, that right there is pretty good. I want it to be a little more opaque than that, though, for this base color. So I'm just going to keep applying this in the same method. Now, this also demonstrates that you can build up the opacity as you go along. The more layers you apply, the more opacity you get, the more coverage you get, the more complete coverage you get. And you don't have that base coat necessarily shining through. I've always thought I should probably paint an aircraft this way just to prove to myself that it will look just fine. Now another thing that I do sometimes, not always, it's just depending on the outcome that I want for the model, is sometimes between layers I'll get a very light sanding agent like a coffee filter or a soft cotton cloth or something like that. And I'll just lightly buff the paint down just to smooth it out just a little. But you can always just test it with your finger and see how much texture does the surface have. Is that more than you want? Is that okay? Is it, you know, is it conforming to what you want? One thing to pay attention to as you get towards the bottom of your palette is the paint will be drying up just a little, so it'll get a little thicker. So be aware of that. Now, can you use a wet palette for this? Yes, you could, but it can be a little harder sometimes to control the water. I like using a dry palette for this because it allows me to control the moisture a little better. And I actually take advantage of the fact that the paint, as it evaporates on the palette, gets a little thicker. I actually want that as I get into my second and third coats. Every now and then I'll get a hair loose from the brush. Just wipe that off. Keep going. Sometimes I get the question, is it okay if I just thin the paint in the bottle so that it's consistent? If you know you're going to be using the paint in one session or maybe over a couple of days, then maybe getting some empty bottles and doing your own thinning in the bottle will just make it simpler. But I don't recommend thinning it and then leaving it sitting, because if you put water into your acrylic paints, it's going to change the chemical mix of it, and it's probably going to separate out, and it may become unusable over time. So I just tend to mix the batches right here in the palette and not worry about pre-mixing it. And if the ratios are not always the same, I don't worry about it. Remember, it's a hobby. We're just having fun. All right, and here's how it looks after just a couple of coats. And you can see it's fairly opaque, fairly smooth. No brush marks or streaks or anything like that. See a couple of places where one of the little bristles or maybe one of my eyelashes or something got into the paint. I'll take my knife and clean that up. Won't be a big deal. But this is a really, really good way to get things painted. Now, this is not something I invented, certainly, and I would not claim that I did. There's a lot of people that demonstrate this. I think my favorite to watch for this technique is a fellow named Richard Gray. He paints wargaming miniatures, and his YouTube channel it's not the biggest channel out there, but I tell you what, you watch his stuff, I don't care what genre you're in, you watch his stuff, you're going to learn some stuff about applying paint, about lighting, about effects, about rust, about weathering, and things like that that I think are very unique and very well presented, and just I find him very entertaining to watch. So definitely look up Richard Gray, and there's certainly others, but he's one that I think you would enjoy watching. So now I'm just going to keep painting the rest of the model and get that done, and we'll see where we go from there. The Wolverine tank. Wolverine, John. Wolverine. Okay, I think I got it. All right, I have the Fury Green applied, and I decided to go with a completely opaque coat for the reasons, and it's looking good. Now at this point, you could decide, okay, I'm going to do the other detail painting in preparation for the weathering and all of the other things that are going to come along. Or if you were going to do any kind of modulation effects or zenithal effects, or just any kind of lighting or lightening up or edge highlighting or any of those things, this is the point where you'd want to do that. And I do want to take a few of those steps. Now, admittedly, when you start doing whether it's any kind of zenithal effects, whether it's any kind of modulation, whether it's dry brushing to bring out edges, whether it's brush edge highlighting, anything like that is a more stylistic approach. And keep in mind, there's nothing wrong with stylistic approaches. It's what you want to do. And some would argue that a stylistic approach makes it look more toy-like. I'm of the opinion that it helps suspend the disbelief quite often when people look at something and see that, okay, it's a plastic toy. Essentially, all of our models are. I think when you do some of those lighting effects, it gives volume, it gives weight, it gives interest to the model, and invites the viewer's brain, so to speak, to kind of step into the world and say, okay, this is something a little different. This is, the brain will assign it more weight, more volume, more shape, because it exaggerates the things that you would expect to see naturally. So, but again, if you're going for a much more realistic look to your model, then don't worry about it. After all, it all gets back to what you want to have fun with. I want to have fun by adding a little bit of simple, very simple lighting effects. Now this time I'm going to use some Gung-Ho Green, again from Two Thin Coats. It's just a lighter color than the Fury Green. And I'm going to apply this pretty much the same way, but I've thinned the paint down even more, and I'm going to dab off more on the brush so that I'm not unloading a lot of moisture. And then I'm just going to spread this around. In some ways, this is going to work kind of like a bit of a sloppy filter, so to speak. And there are going to be some bubbles. I'm okay with that. Because what it's going to do is it's going to start imparting a sense of color distressing to the paint finish. I'm just going to put this along here, and I'm just going to take it down on this surface all the way down to that back edge, like that. I'm going to do up here on the top of the turret. Better hold it down. Remember, it's not glued on. But just any of the straight upturned surfaces that are going to catch light, I just want to emphasize them just a little. And if you're doing this, there's no perfect way of doing it. If you decide to take it a little bit down the side of the turret or down the side of the tank, that's fine. It's whatever you think is going to look good. Whatever's going to achieve the effect that you are trying to achieve. There's a couple of ways to deal with the turret. You can take the turret off and just completely add in the lighter color. I'm going to go with a method that kind of outlines the turret. Now, it does look a little odd if the turret position is changed, but I'm okay with that. Don't forget that if you have any sub-assemblies that need to connect onto your model, don't forget to give them the same paint treatment or decide whether it needs it before moving on. All right, I've finished that process of adding the Gung-Ho Green to it. And it's fairly subtle. When you look at it from the top, it looks like one single color, but when you look at it from the side, you kind of get a sense of the change in tone between the two areas. You could take it further. Certainly if you were doing an airbrush, you could do a traditional modulated finish or something more zenithal. But even with a brush, I could have, because that paint was very thin, I could have started at the top and applied some most of the way down and then took it a little less down and a little less down so that it would give more of a modulated appearance. That's just not really what I was going for. I'm just doing something simple. Now, at this point, I could do a more traditional tabletop method and dry brush the whole thing with a lighter color to really bring out all of the details. If you're going for more of a tabletop look, or like I've said, if that is part of the stylistic look that you're trying to achieve, then using an even lighter green or even something like ivory or deck tan or something like that to dry brush will help bring out many of the details and things like that and help show the volumes and so forth on the model. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a paint, another 2 thin coats paint, and this is an even lighter one called Green Beret. And what I'm going to do is, instead of using my dry brush, I'm going to just use a traditional round brush, and I'm going to paint in some of the higher parts of the tank just to help those stand out even more. So let me get the paint prepared and I'll show you what I'm talking about. And what I'm going to do with this Green Beret green is I'm just going to go around to some of the highest areas on the model. And I've thinned this less than I did the other paint. This is probably about 2 parts paint, 1 part water. It's still fairly thin, but I'm just going to put this in on higher surfaces like this here, the tops of the turrets, and I will take multiple coats of it to make sure that I don't have any, obviously brush strokey areas. I could use a smaller dry brush here, but I just want a little more control. So that's why I'm going with a brush, and just kind of let me bring out some details like this. And the reason I'm doing this is as I add weathering layers later, it's going to minimize most of these lighting effects. So by punching up some areas ahead of time, I'll leave those areas as standing out just a little more. So with the later weathering that moderates the effect, they stand on their own and will hopefully hold their place and hold their shape and their volume better, and it'll just help contribute to the look of it. If you've ever watched Adam Wilder's KV1 series, which I highly recommend, it's on YouTube. Just do a search for Adam Wilder KV1. But if you watch the very first episode, he shows a few views of the paint that he had put down on the model before he started the weathering, and it's very, very highly modulated. But as you watch the series, you see how that modulation really contributes to the final look. Because if you look at those shots in the first video and then skip down in the playlist to the last one, and you see how the final result is, kind of makes more sense. So, but again, just a very stylistic approach. Now another thing I'm going to do, and this is going to take a little while, is I'm going to paint the tops of all the bolts. This is where if you were dry brushing it, you would get it done really quick. But I'm going to have to take just a little while. I want these to stand out as well. All right, you can see the highlighting that I've done here. And I got all the bolt heads and the tops of most of the surfaces. Even got the tops of these little doohickeys here. That's the official name. It's a doohickey. Just because that stands out a little bit. And it just kind of brings out, like I said, it brings out the volumes, brings out the shapes. And as later weathering is applied, those should hold out pretty good in that. Now, I could have been far more deliberate in doing this. I could have used multiple blends and glazing, and tried to do more of a modulated effect. I could have. There's a lot more that could be done with this. So certainly don't think that what I've shown here is kind of an end-all be-all. It's just a very simplified version of what could be done. Now, for what I'm trying to accomplish with this model, I feel like it's sufficient. But I could have spent a lot more time doing this, used a lot more blends, because even though I used these 3 paints here, I could have blended each of them together in equal parts and come up with 5 colors between the 3 of them. And then if I would have gone for ratios a little different from that, it would have been even beyond that. So you can certainly make choices in terms of color to go as far down that rabbit hole as you want, but I try to keep it reasonably simple. Now, of course, there are other things that need to be painted on the model. The next biggest thing that I think I'm going to focus on is the tracks. There's, of course, the tracks here where we see them where you expect them to be. There's some tracks along here that are hung onto the sides of the armor plates, some here on the back. These are probably meant to be tracks, but they're only single link tracks, and it just looks weird to me, so I'm not going to treat these as tracks. I'm going to treat them as, I don't know, something else. Maybe just leave them that part of the color and chip them. Haven't decided that yet. But certainly these, and of course these can be tracks. Now, a traditional way of doing this with wargaming, with tabletop gaming, certainly with Warhammer 40K miniatures, is they start off painting them silver, show that, and then add some washes in to dull them down, to outline them, maybe add a little bit of rust tones. If you're more of a traditional armor modeler, you tend to come into it from a different direction, that it's usually not silver. It may start off as black or other things and then add rust tones and steel tones and things like that. So there's a lot of ways of going into it. What I like to do is to start off looking at treads on tanks and other tracked vehicles. Don't forget that you've got bulldozers and other, heavy equipment like that have tracks on them, and just seeing what they look like. And in most cases, even if they're fairly clean and fairly new, they're not going to be necessarily bright, shiny silver. They're probably going to be something that's kind of a worn steel look, maybe the beginnings of rust, but a little bit of dirt, a little bit of dullness to them. So the color I like to use for this is a Citadel color, Steel Legion Drab. Now, this is really just it's kind of greeny, but it's a brown color, but it's a very desaturated color. It's one that is somewhat khaki in nature. Now, there's different variations of khaki. It can be more green, it can be more brown, it can be brighter, it can be more dull. I like this one, but certainly any color of this type
will work. I like this as a base because then, as you'll see in another episode, we can add, and even I can add, chipping on top of it, washes on top of it, other things like that to impart a steel look, a rusted look, and then eventually it's going to get covered in mud. So eventually it's going to be mud. So this kind of looks forward to, well, where are we going with this? And where I'm going with this is a muddy, dirty, dusty look. And this is going to be a good base coat for that. Now I've thinned the paint about 1-to-1 paint and water. So it's fairly thin, but still controllable. And I'm just going to begin applying this on there. And if it's a little patchy, I'm okay with that. Because again, these tracks, they're going to look rather beat up by the end. And you're not likely to see a whole lot of this paint anyway once it's on there. So I guess in some regard, it doesn't matter. But at the same time, by painting it this color, I don't have to spend a lot of time fighting with it to try and, like if I painted it in a bright silver, I might have to spend quite a bit of time trying to tone that down. So this starts off already toned down and just gives me the opportunity to, I guess you'd say, brighten it up where necessary, but already with a foundation of mud applied to it, dust and dirt and all of those things like that. You could get away with, I've done this before, paint it like this, do some sponge chipping or dry brushing with a dark gray or a medium gray, and then just hit it with a brown wash or a rust wash, and it'll look pretty good, especially if you're using it for tabletop purposes. Now, as I'm painting this, I'll talk about painting the rest of the model. There are some parts that I paint before I start the weathering, of course, like the main colors and these tracks. There may be other parts that you will want to paint before you do the weathering, because the weathering will, of course, go over those. But some of the parts may be smaller, and the weathering, because if you're going to be doing weathering, say, in large swaths, you're going to be hitting it with a lot of washes or things like that. There may be some parts and pieces that you want to hold off doing the main painting for until you get the basic weathering on, and then go back and add in the colors for those specific areas, and then do a little bit of weathering back over those. So it all depends on what your plan is, what your end game is, and what makes sense to you. Now, of course, there's going to be times when you're doing this and you try one method and you may realize, okay, I tried it this way before and that didn't work the way I expected, so I'm going to do some different thing. That's always a great way to learn. That's how you learn and grow in the hobby, is trying something, see what works and what doesn't. Don't get hung up about, am I going to ruin my model? None of us are perfect. All our models are going to have flaws. So flaws, mistakes, happy accidents, as Bob Ross would title them, they teach us things. You get experience from mistakes, and the only way you make mistakes is just by trying things. So you try stuff. Now, a lot of the little details that I'm going to wait to paint, I'll give you an example. Where are they at? Was it on here? Yeah, the little tools there on the back. I could paint those in a silver or in another color, but there's a lot of washes and stuff that I want to do later on that I may want to brighten those up. So I may just leave those like they are, working under the premise that they're just going to be painted over when the rest of the model is painted, or when the rest of the tank was painted, thinking realistically. And then I can just go back in and do some additional chipping and weathering over that. But there are some other areas, like these tracks and other areas that I want to go ahead and base. Like I'm going to base these exhausts, which I'll show in just a minute. And there may be a few other areas, knowing that I can always go back and boost up the colors on any of the things that I need to as I move forward through the build. So trial and error will teach you over time what your preferred method is, but don't ever forget that if something doesn't work out exactly like you want, there is nothing that says you can't go back and repaint it. Remember, it's just a plastic toy. That's all it is. Something to keep in mind when you're working on your own model. Some tank treads have rubber cleats on them. So there's a metal part, but then there'll be a shoe or a cleat, however you want to think of it, that will be some kind of hard rubber, hard plastic, hard something other than metal. And those are usually presented as, those are usually dark gray or black or something like that. So certainly if you're doing a real world model, then, check your references to see what the actual thing looks like. But if you're doing something that's more sci-fi, fantasy, whatever like that, then look at the actual shape of it. Generally, if they intend to present something as having some kind of rubber cleat on it or something like that, it will be fairly apparent. But at the same time, if you think that would look good to paint it that way, even if it doesn't appear to be that way, we'll paint it that way. You could do that on this model here. You could paint these more squarish parts here black, and then the links in between them give them some kind of metallic appearance. So it's certainly, as with all things, when you're building your model, and it is your model, it's what you want it to look like. Something else, and this is something that I always forget, don't forget to paint the sides of the tracks. I don't know how many times I've gotten to the end of the model and I'll be taking photos to proudly stick in the middle of a video or the end of a video to say, look what I did. And I'm looking along it, and it's a whole row of treads down there. Not a stitch of paint on it. So don't do what I do. Paint it all the way around. All right, as you can see, this is take 2. I'm basing the exhausts in Vallejo Sky Gray. It's a very, very light gray, but it's a great basis for exhaust, for things that are going to be rusted. Anything that's going to have rust effects over it. This is a great base color. If you've ever watched Martin Kovach over at Night Shift Scale Models, you've seen him use light gray and other lighter colors like that as the basis for his rust effects. Adam Wilder on the KV1 series that he did used a light gray, kind of a almost bluish gray, for his exhausts. So it's just good color to put down beneath everything else for the effects that are going to go over it. Now that's going to be in a later episode, but I'm going to go ahead, because it's a fairly large piece, I'm going to go ahead and put this on like this. Now there may be a few more parts that I paint with a simple base color. Like I'm going to imagine this is a fuel cap. In my world, all fuel caps are red. So I'll probably paint that red. But I've been known to change my mind too. And forget. So I may change my mind. I may paint it red. I may forget I said anything about it. Who knows? I'm going to go ahead and, as I continue to paint this, call this a video. What I've covered It's basically your base painting, with a brush. Hey, there's some alliteration. Basically brush, base, painting, whatever. You can tell I'm probably needing a nap. It's getting later on in the day. And I'm going to call it a video. You can paint fewer things, paint more things. You can airbrush it, do whatever you want. The idea is this is part of the process to finishing the model. And you have to think about how does what happens at this stage play out through the entire build. Because if you plan this as kind of a part of a system that's going to lead through to the finished model, well, how do you do that in a way recognizing that it's not just a series of unrelated steps, but rather it's part of a system of systems. So that's what I try to do. And it's always refined over time with trial and error as you build more models. And I think that's where the fun comes in. Because the more models you build, the more fun you have. And the more things you learn, the better you get at what you're doing. And the better you get at what you're doing, the more fun you have. And so it just kind of builds along the way. So I'll close as I always do. If you've watched my videos, you know what it is. If you're not having fun, you're doing it wrong. I really believe that, and I really mean that. So keep having fun. Happy day to you, friends. Bye-bye.